Well, hello. There's a particular poignancy for me giving this lecture at this time, because the reason I became a process theologian in the first place was because of the problem of evil. And for me, it wasn't so much the massive evil that was experienced in the world, it was the personal evil, the little things, like babies who die, a car in the highway that bumps into another car and its full gas tank explodes and a family is annihilated, a friend whose son is in what in those days was called an insane asylum, a woman just stricken with a devastating disease. Evil felt like more than was necessary in the world. And I know we weren't promised a rose garden. I never thought we were, but it just seemed there could be a few less thorns. And my theology wasn't working. Now, I had learned enough. I was still a very young woman. I had learned enough to know to trust God instead of my theology. It wasn't a question of, is there a God? For me, it's never been that question. I feel like I was born God-oriented, and I could no more deny that than I could, I guess, stop being myself. So it was never a question of, oh, there's all this evil, therefore there's no God. It wasn't that at all. But in light of the way experience was working out in this world, there had to be a better way of thinking about God than I had. So what did I do? Well, I went back to school, of course. I took courses in philosophy. I didn't quite dare take courses in religion. They were too close to home. I took a lot of courses in philosophy, and then I went on to, you can't stop. Why would you stop when there's more you can study, right? Well, the next thing to study was a PhD, so of course I went and started doing that too. Only it happened to be in philosophy of religion. It was really tough in those days. You know, I speak about this as a kind of a personal experience of evil, but no matter how massive, it's always personal. It's always personal. It's one by one by one by one. And us, who are not directly involved, oh yes, we are directly involved. All evil is personal. So, then I encountered process thought. I felt all the pieces falling together. I finally felt like I had a way to say it. And you know, theology has always been faith-seeking understanding. And it's not the case that, oh good, this understanding is now the way it is. Thank you, God, I now know exactly how you've put it together. I don't mean that. Process thought gave me a way of coherently putting together the world so that I could then see God in this world, no matter what the evil. And so, this lecture was scheduled a long time ago for how many days after? Tuesday, September 11th. And so you will hear the answer I'm developing. And you may think aloud or to yourself, oh, I don't know, Marjorie, it doesn't answer to it. My dears, I'm sure it doesn't. But it's as far as I've come thus far. So I'm going to ask you to come with me on the journey of how does process thought address the issue of evil. Not from the point of, why do we have it? That was never the thing that worried me so much, because I knew we had it. It was very clear. It was obvious. We have evil. How we got it was much less important to me then, and what's to be done about it. How does God help us get through it? And what's the final answer anyhow? See, for me, it wasn't enough to say, well, there's heaven and there's hell. And there's a nice separation between those who do evil, who clearly go to that place, and those who do, or even if you said, and if you have faith, then you'll go to this place and not this place, and evil is finally satisfied because there's a terrific punishment for evil, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. To me, that's not an answer. So long as evil endures, evil has the last word over God. I needed a way to think of God in such a way that there is no evil, not one, that God cannot overcome, either in history or everlastingly in the divine nature. God is the overcomer of evil. Process gave me a way to formulate the how of that felt adequate to my own hungry soul. So let me take you into a process journey, looking at the issue then in this way. First, I'm going to give you a very quick and insufficient outline of what is really a very powerful model. I'm just going to give you the tip of the iceberg of this model because that's all we need for this afternoon. After I give you the model, then I'm going to show you how that model helps in terms of understanding what is to be done with evil in this world. And moving from there into the third portion, which is, and what about everlasting? Is the last word really people falling out of 105th story to their death? Is that the last word? Is that the end of evil? Or is there more? So then, with these horrible questions in mind, and recognizing the grief that we carry around because we are each one of us wounded in our depths of our souls by the events of these past 2 weeks, to the point where the tears are close to the top. With that background then, come with me to the journey. So what is this process model all about anyhow? It's really very simple. It really is. Think of it this way. Existence, as we see it, is the end result of a dynamic process that produces electron after molecule after molecule, after cell, after rocks, after animals, after trees, all the way up to us, if up is the correct word. That existence is a process that follows this particular dynamic. To exist is to be pushed or pulled into existence itself, into becoming from the powerful forces from a past that insist there shall be a future to account for them. That's one. From these energies streaming from the past, a new entity becomes. And if that's all there were, new entities streaming from the past, you wouldn't get beyond chaos to the order of a universe. There is at the same time not only the influence of energies from the past, but in every moment whatsoever, there is an influence from God which streams like an energy, conjoined with that energy from the past, indicating ways to integrate that past in this present moment of becoming. In every moment of your existence, you, at your most fundamental level, are dealing with energy events that push on you, or pull on you, to become in a certain way. So, imagine then all of this energy pushing toward another moment of existence. What does that moment of existence become? Well now, the past influences it, God influences it, and you could say that God's influence is in the form of a future. Because if the past pushes for its repetition, God's call pushes for this is how you might yet become given this circumstance, which is a future. And then the third one kicks in. The becoming piece of reality must integrate all these energies and choose to become one thing. Whitehead goes to greater lengths than you would ever want me to explain in the immediacy of this moment, describing to you the process of that integrative movement whereby this becoming piece of energy becomes one thing. It's an integration of the past and of God's future that involves a sifting and a sorting and a contrasting and a negating and an affirming and evaluations and emotions as all these energies become woven together like that. And then the energy event has become. But having become, what it has become joins either the cacophony or the harmony of voices demanding some accounting of itself in the next moment. So that the process is receiving, integrating, giving. Receiving, integrating, giving. Receiving, integrating, giving. Again and again and again and again. Now when Whitehead develops this, truly enough, he begins with an analysis of human experience. But he's also a physicist, deeply affected by his own discoveries in physics. He developed a relativity theory of time, but also by quantum physics. And his analysis of existence had to be such that it could take account of personal experience and the most, well, what you say, hard-hearted look at this physical universe and integrate the two of them. And this simple little model that I've given you was his answer. To exist is to receive the energy of the past, to integrate it in the present, and to become an influence on a future. And in a sense, that's all there is to the basic model. Now the truth is, if you were to do the right work and get into Whitehead, you would start screaming at me, "What do you mean, Marjorie? It's not at all simple." And then my answer to you would be, "So it's the universe. Why do you think it should be simple?" I mean, really. In a way, even simplifying it like this is almost a parody. And yet, that's the dynamic. Receiving, integrating, giving. Receiving, integrating, giving. Okay, basic model. Simple enough? Got it? Easy. Step 2. So how does this model address the issue of evil that we experience in a world like this? Well, one of the first things it points up for you, of course, is that the world is not God's great puppeteering design. Remember I said the energy of the past exercises an influence? What is the energy of a past? It's your family, it's yourself. Your own past choices influence what you do now. Your family influences what you do now. Your ethnic context influences what you do now. Your country of origin influences what you do now. Your culture influences what you do now. Your very makeup as a human being in this universe influences what you do now. There's a past beating down upon you that insists upon its repetition in every moment. And there's also God, knowing your past thoroughly, giving you an influence also in every moment. So, that which influences you in your own becoming creatively is not just God, but also the world. And in every moment, you are called upon to decide what to do with these two influences. So there's 3 forms of creative influence. Your past, God, yourself. Which one is responsible for evil? And the answer has to be, it is a contextual situation that influences you to evil. Plus, the horrible perplexity that what seems good to one can be horrible evil to another. A past can so condition you that it will seem good to you to crash into the World Trade Center. A holy act of martyrdom, giving up your life for something so important. It can seem good to you if in fact the past that chooses you and that you choose in return so influences you. And what can God do with you then? What can God do with you then? None of us has the model that, well, what God can do with you then is come right down and take your hand and force your fingers open so that the knife drops, and you suddenly get a total change of heart, and you ask everybody would they like Coca-Cola or 7-Up or whatever. We don't have a God like that, and we never did. We never did. We have a God who works with us in our context, and we say by faith, and happily by a model, that God's influence is always toward inclusive well-being. God's influence is toward the well-being of the widest possible community. So that we have to say from our point of view of judgment that God's influence would have been away from this evil deed. But the third force of creativity is the ability of persons to override it in favor of a hatred, a holy hatred that governs them. So it's a complex situation, but the role of God is to influence us toward that which is the more inclusive good. But when it doesn't happen, what then? Has God just plain failed? And we should all feel sorry for God. Well, in a sense, I do feel sorry for God. I really do. Because, see, in this way of thinking, in order to give that influence, the price of that influence is God's feeling of the world as it feels itself in every moment. That God, as a singular and single reality, experiences the world and feels it within the divine nature. God feels it not in a mediated way like we did, by looking with horror at a TV screen or shutting off the radio because we can't hear it anymore. God experiences it as it is experienced by those who feel it directly, so that God experiences it in the divine nature. And I imagined last week the screaming of God, experiencing all of that agony. But I could also imagine the screaming of God feeling the hatred in the hearts, which would pierce, I would think, the heart of God. And the agony of God over whatever horrible situation forced persons into thinking this way in the first place. What hungers did they see? What deprivations did they experience? What oppressions did they attribute to us? God felt those feelings too. Yeah, I think it's a good image for what we do to God in our own experiences of pain. So that God, experiencing the pain with us, then offers us back yet again a way of transformation. For some, those who died, those 5,000, or that little baby who died, that started me on my sad journey, for some, there's no redemption in this world. Evil has destroyed them, cut down their lives, and they are gone, not even there to be buried. Does that mean God is totally ineffective in this world, in this model? God feels the past in order to give us who also feel that past a way to deal with it transformatively. So that part of the answer to this horrible pain in us and in those who died and in God is a steady and faithful influence to the good. You might think it a small thing. No, you don't. How many people were prompted to give blood? How many people have been driven to prayer? How many people have been driven to contribute of their own wealth to help those who have been so devastated? Do you think this is just nothing? It's part of the transformative work of God in the world, that God, experiencing that past too, feeds back to the world in myriad places, to all who are affected by that past, ways of transformation. This is a salvific work of God in this world. It's not as good as if those guys hadn't done this, but it's the slow, transformative work of God that will, in fact, overcome evil in our histories to whatever extent is possible. Now, do you think I am saying, oh, isn't it great that we had this tragedy so all this good could come? No way. It's terrible that we had this tragedy, that even God has to experience it. But there is no tragedy which is stronger than God. This I believe. And God's answer in history is experiencing this pain too and giving us ways of overcoming. We're so used to this happening that we take it for granted. And I'm suggesting to you, well, yeah, you can take it for granted, but I want you to think too about the work of God in this world. God works through us to accomplish the well-being of the world. And your own experiences of impulses toward the good, guess what? You may not have thought it up yourself out of the blue. God works with every one of you, regardless of your theological stance, so I say in my arrogance. God works with you toward the good. It doesn't mean, yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo, would you please do this good now? No, no, no. God's influence comes to us at the base of our experience, deeper than our thought, deeper than our unconscious. And you respond to it one way or another. And that response of doing what good is yet possible is the redemptive work of God in this world. Now, it's also the redemptive work of the people who go and do those things. Because everybody has the capability of saying thanks, but not me, somebody else can do it. And to the extent that we deny participating in the good, we then become necessarily participations in the continuing evil effects of that which has been so tragic. But insofar as we respond, we then become co-workers with God and God's instruments, partners in working yet toward what forms of transformation are possible. One of my enduring learnings about this kind of thing comes from years ago, and it's out of the horror of, at that time, incredible tragedy, which was, as you well know, the Holocaust. I have been so moved by Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychologist who lost everything, everything. Those he loved, his work, everything in the Holocaust. And yet, out of this experience, wrote this incredible gem called Man's Search for Meaning. That through this horrible fire, there was a refinement of sheerest gold. Is it good that there was a Holocaust so that we could get that book? No, no, it wasn't good. But no Holocaust can stop the transforming power of God. And it will come sometimes in dramatic ways and more often in tiny ways, but it is the work of God in and through us. William Blake said it a long time ago, God has no hands but ours. Well, what's so bad about that? So, a process way of understanding the redemptive power of God in history is to say that God feels our tragedies with us. Whitehead called God the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. God knows our history so well, so experientially, that God is capable of leading us toward that which is transformative in the next moment. It may be baby steps, and it will never, ever seem like enough. But it's transformation. And it's the work of God. So God takes the circumstances as they are and brings us through that ever-given influence toward what can yet be. But what about those on the 105th floor? Or what about the wife who received the call and knew the moment of her husband's death? What about the kids left behind? What about those who are killed, who evil's power is strong enough to destroy? That's what evil is, the destruction of the good. Evil is strong enough to destroy irremediably in terms of history. Because no matter what kind of work God makes happen in this world, they are not alive to participate in it. And the sorrow and the agony of the folks who have to go through working that transformation process, we have all known grief. The mere compounding of grief staggers the imagination. They've got to work through it. What of those who experience the finality of evil? Is that the last word? Okay, God, you do what you can during this world, but some things are just too much for you. When evil accomplishes its task of destruction, too bad for you. Get on with it. And I think no. I really refuse that answer. So that if history is all you get, there's too much evil that triumphs over good, and too much evil that triumphs over God. And I don't think that's the way it is. And one of the reasons why process has been so important to me is because process gave me a way to conceptualize an alternative. And for me, it wasn't enough to say, oh, it's all right, they go to heaven. That wasn't enough. I had to think into it. Sometimes you're damned to think. That's what Fred Sontag told me one time. Faith seeking understanding. For me, I just needed a way to conceptualize it. And here's what process provided for me. I've said it several times. God experiences the world the way the world is. Well, what's this mean? Remember the model? Energy from the past enters into you. Oh. And you integrate that energy and then you give it. Well, to whom do you give it? Well, the answer is to every existent reality whatsoever. Oh. Does God exist? Yes. Then that which you have become is, in every moment, a gift to God. Now, this can have horrible consequences if you think about it. That God receives the world in every moment of its moment by moment by moment by moment completion. Now think about what this means, and I've already indicated some of it. It's not a very nice thought, but think about it. Remember what I said? If God experiences the world, then God experiences every moment involved in the tragedy of last week as it's experienced. I fly over 50,000 miles a year. I am on an awful lot of airplanes. And I've thought so much of the experience of those people on the airplane. The terror. And it's a sheer physiological response of terror. Worse than those in the buildings. God experiences that terror and it becomes a gift to God, thank you, in every moment. You'd think God would be smart enough to say thanks, but no thanks, I don't want this present, it's not Christmas yet. But God, if God is God, must receive in every moment the experience of everything whatsoever that exists in this world. It is not a happy thing to be a God. It's hard enough for us experiencing it partially. God experiences it immediately, in and through the immediacy of that which God feels. Now, there are wonderful technological ways to explain through Whitehead why it is that God reenacts, resurrects the person in God at every moment. So that it's not the case that last breath, that's it, thank you, goodbye, is the end of it. That there is beyond this history, there is also that which is within the life of God. If God receives the world in every moment, God is the resurrection of the world. Well then, what happens now? You're in strictly fantasy land, speculating on the basis of a little model and on the basis of a firm Christian conviction that comes to you not from a model, but from your long history, that in fact God is the power of resurrection. What would happen if you take this model and begin to think about resurrection in terms of this dynamic? Remember I said the energy is received and then integrated in contrasting, evaluating emotional ways so that all these streams of energy become a new satisfaction which is then given. Well, if God is an actual reality, an existent reality, the same process would be true of God. That God would receive the energy of the world in its entirety So the fullness of those who have died is resurrected into the life of God, there to be, well, the philosophical work would be evaluated. The theological word would be judged. Now, some have said it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, and I suspect that's exactly true. Because my understanding, both from historical and theological and traditional reasons, is that God is love. The problem with God being love is it means that God is a will toward the well-being of that which is loved. So now, imagine these resurrected ones in the life of God. They would experience God's evaluation of them in that moment and throughout that trajectory which had been their lives. They meet themselves as God sees them in the divine life. In the process of integration into the depths of God, that which is evil in them is burned away, till they be conformed, whether they like it or not, to the image of divine love. Now, in a sense, this theology suggests to you that God is heaven and God is hell, and God is that which is between them, which is a kind of a purgatory or a purgation process, where one is transformed into the love of God. It would be so in this process that to be in God is to experience everything that God is experiencing. So the hijackers, in addition to their own terror, experience the terror of everyone else whom they have caused to suffer. It would not be a happy thing at all. But nonetheless, they too are integrated into the reality of God till they be conformed to the divine image. In my own family history, I had this wonderful son-in-law, name of Butch. And Butch contracted myelocytic leukemia, and he was dying, and eventually died. But before he died, when he knew there was very little hope of his making it, he wrote letters to his boys. His kids were 2 years old, 6 years old, and 8 years old. He wrote letters. And Graham shared his letter with me. And it said, and you might think this just poetic, it said to him, when you are on a hill on a summer day and you feel a breeze, I'm in that breeze with you. When you're crying, I feel your tears with you. In a process frame of reference, this would be true. Because those who are taken into God then would participate in God. And since God continues to participate in the world by way of an influence toward that which is now possible, then in fact, in and through God, Butch is present to his children. And if you carry it through, in and through God, if God is the resurrection and the life, in and through God, those who have been taken into God participate in God's transforming influence toward those they still love here in Earth's history. Now, this is all very fanciful, and I know that. But you know, I know my mother comes to me. I just know she's present to me every now and then, mediated to me in and through the reality that she is present in God, and God is present with me in every single moment. I just know that. Oh, maybe I make it up. I don't care what you say. I know that. And process gives me a conceptuality that allows me to say that there is a resurrection, that evil does not have the last word, even for those whom it so thoroughly destroys. That God is the power of resurrection, literally. And that God takes all into the divine self, and we will also be in this situation, taken into the life of God, experiencing it firsthand, and being, well, I say it, forced by God, in God, to be transformed into the divine image, participating in the ongoing work of God in this world. Now I say forced for a reason. God's influence on us toward transformation or forms of historical resurrection in this world are not all powerful. Because we do have the power to say no thanks. We do have the power to resist them, choosing instead the gradient of our past which works against that which is better. We have the power to say no. And the kingdom of God will only be partially achieved in this earth ever. So that in this world, resurrection will always be finite, partial, but oh, it is to be valued. In God, God is a singular entity, and it's God who governs our integration into the divine nature, and in God that integration will accomplish the divine purposes. We will be made conformable to the love of God, whether we like it or not. And it might be very difficult at first, but I suspect that finally it will meet the heart's desire of every creature that ever existed. So God is the end of evil. Not in some final way, there's a great apocalypse and it all burns up and that's the end, goodbye, signed off, over. God is the end of evil. In history, in a partial way, because we must work with God to see that transformation occurs. We are responsible to be a co-creator with God in bringing about the good, no matter how bad the evil, no matter how bad. And in fact, the worse it is, the more responsible we are to reach toward the good and not just simply replicate more of it all by ourselves so we can increase the agony and pain and suffering of the world and of God. We are called by God to see to inclusive well-being. And we will do it, more or less. But in God, by God who is grace, there will be a final overcoming of evil. And that final overcoming in the depths of God feeds back into the world, pushing us toward those little or those great things that bring about historical triumphs. In my family, with my little kids, I have seen the resurrection power of God in this way. My little grandkids, who suffered so dreadfully, and whose prayers for their daddy's life were not answered in the way they hoped. I have seen them grow in these past 9 years into loving, responsible teenagers, if you can believe it. Loving, responsible teenagers. And in seeing Butch's sons become loving, responsible teenagers, I see a healing of Butch by the grace of God and the responsive power of people who surround those kids still with love. Also, God with us in and through the community. In these terrible times, and we don't even know if we've seen the worst of it yet, Christian faith, mediated and expressed for me through process theology, says God is not mocked, and it is not the last word. Evil is not the last word. God offers possibilities of transformation in history, and we must rise to be co-workers with God, bringing about that transforming action. Receiving these horrible influences into ourselves, receiving at the same time God's influence to transformation, integrating them into who we are, and coming out stronger for the good. And God is the everlasting overcoming of evil by being the God of resurrection power. Well, that's one way of putting it. Take it as it is, or go on and think up something else.